An old man saw a kitchen girl kneeling in the dust and forgot how to breathe. He had known that face for exactly 4 seconds. He had known that necklace for 18 years. Everyone else in the courtyard saw a servant being punished for dropping a bowl. Baba Kando saw something no one else in that palace was still alive to recognize: a small, scratched circle of gold, engraved on its back with a crescent moon cradling 3 stars that he had fastened with his own trembling hands around the neck of a newborn princess on the last night he ever saw her alive. The kingdom believed that princess had died in a fire 18 years ago. The whole kingdom had wept for her. The whole kingdom had moved on, except the necklace had not burned, and neither, he now understood. Looking at the kneeling girl in front of him, had she, "Girl," he whispered, crouching beside her while the queen's voice still rang across the courtyard. "Where did you get that?" "I don't know," Zuri said, 18 years old and utterly unaware that the question had just split her whole life in 2. "I have had it since I was a baby." He did not answer. He could not. The last time he had seen that exact mark, he had been carrying a screaming infant out of a burning nursery. Moments before he made a decision he had never told a living soul about. And across that courtyard, Queen Adisua was watching him with an expression that had nothing to do with a broken bowl at all. Her name was Zuri. She was 18 years old, and she had worked in the royal kitchen since a woman named Mama Folktales, who had raised her from infancy in a small house 2 days' walk from the palace, brought her to the palace gate at the age of 12 and humbly asked whether the kitchens needed another pair of hands. Zuri woke before the birds did. She swept the floor, carried water, prepared food, and slept on a mat behind the kitchen store with 2 other girls. She was not unhappy. Exactly. She did not know enough about any other life to measure her own against it. But she had learned, the way children raised in service learn everything, that there was a shape to her place in that palace, and the shape was small. Queen Adisua had never liked her from her very first year in that kitchen. She never explained why. Not from the first year, and not from the first month. Zuri had stopped wondering. The way a person stops wondering why the rain falls on some days and not others. It was simply a fact of her world. A palace girl, without royal blood, the queen liked to say, usually within Zuri's hearing, should remember her place. On the morning this story begins, a delegation from the eastern provinces was visiting the palace, and the whole household had been set to preparing a formal service. Zuri was carrying a wide ceremonial bowl across the courtyard. Part of that service, when her foot caught a raised stone, the bowl struck the ground and rang out like a bell across the whole courtyard. Every head turned. Queen Adisua was on the far side of the courtyard when the bowl fell. She did not hurry. She crossed the stone slowly, and the delegation and guards and household staff all made way for her. And by the time she reached Zuri, the whole courtyard had gathered to watch what would happen next. "This," she told the gathered courtyard, "is what happens when gratitude curdles into carelessness. This girl was given a place here out of charity. She repays it by breaking what does not belong to her." "Kneel," she said. Zuri knelt, and kept her eyes on the stones beneath her, 41 of them. In that particular stretch of courtyard, though she had never counted on purpose, the way she had learned to, during moments exactly like this one, still and silent, waiting for the words to pass over her like weather. It was somewhere around the queen's 3rd sentence that a retired steward named Baba Kando, walking along the courtyard's edge out of old habit, glanced at the kneeling girl, and stopped where he stood. He crossed to her without quite deciding to, crouched down, and asked the question that would undo 18 years of careful silence. Queen Adisua's voice cut across the courtyard. "Baba Kundo, is there a difficulty?" "No difficulty, my queen," he said. Only an old man remembering something. He walked away without another word, and Zuri knelt there a moment longer before the queen finally released her with a curt wave, and she rose, brushed the dust from her knees, and went back to her work with an ache in her chest. She could not name no idea, yet, that she had just become the most dangerous secret in the entire kingdom. Before we continue, please like this video and subscribe so you never miss a story, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? That Evening Zuri sat alone by the dying kitchen fire, and did what she rarely allowed herself to do. Think about the necklace. She knew almost nothing about where she had come from. Mama Folktale, who had died when Zuri was 14, had told her only fragments. Always the same ones. I found you when you were very small. Keep the necklace, neighbor cell, never take it off. Zuri had obeyed those instructions faithfully. She had never once, in 6 years of wearing it openly, examined it closely enough to notice its engraving. She'd always assumed it was simple decoration, the way old things sometimes carry patterns without meaning. Baba Kondo had noticed immediately. The next morning, he found her alone in the kitchen and asked, gently, whether he might look at it properly, in good light. She hesitated, then lifted it over her head and placed it in his open palm. He turned it over, a crescent moon, cradling 3 small stars, exactly as he remembered it, fastened around an infant's throat 18 years earlier. He waited until the household slept, then went alone to the palace's old archive, a room few people had reason to visit anymore. It took him nearly 2 hours to find what he needed, a portrait of the infant princess. Painted weeks after her birth, a small golden necklace visible at her throat. Beside it, folded into the same box, the goldsmith's original commission notes. The notes were explicit, in a way that left no room for doubt. The necklace had been made specifically for the reigning family's firstborn child, and for no one else in the kingdom's history. The crescent star's mark appeared on no other piece of jewelry, on no merchant's stock, on no noble family's crest, but the ruling house's own. It was not merely similar, it was the same necklace, the same small, worn shape, the same faint irregularity along one edge, where the goldsmith's hand had not been perfectly even. Baba Kondo sat with that portrait until the lamp burned low, and by sunrise he was no longer asking himself whether the girl could be connected to the missing princess. He was beginning to fear that she was the princess. It was not yet certainty, he told himself. Moretan once, on the walk back to his quarters. A necklace, however exact the match, was still only an object, and objects could be inherited or gifted, or passed down through hands that had nothing to do with the palace at all. He needed more than a mark on a piece of gold before he allowed himself to believe something this large. But the fear did not leave him. Over the following days, it only grew. He did not act immediately. A claim like this one, spoken carelessly to the wrong person, could get a poor kitchen girl killed rather than restored. So he watched it instead, quietly, carefully. He noticed she hummed a melody she could not name. One Baba Kondo recognized instantly, because he had heard the old king sing that exact tune to his infant daughter. He noticed that, sent on an errand into an unfamiliar wing, she turned without hesitation down the corridor toward the old sealed nursery before catching herself, confused. He noticed a small, pale scar behind her left ear, and when he found the princess's birth record, it noted an identical mark in an identical place, and he noticed that whenever she was frightened, her hand rose to the necklace, the exact gesture a mother had once fondly remarked upon in her own infant daughter. Queen Adisua noticed him noticing. She had not survived that palace's politics for 18 years without an instinct for exactly the kind of quiet, purposeful attention he had been paying to the kitchens, to the old archive, to a girl who had never before merited anyone's careful watching. She summoned him to her private receiving room. "Baba Kondo," she said, once the doors were closed. "You have been asking a great many questions this week. About kitchen staff, about old household records. I would like to know what you are actually looking for." An old man's idle curiosity. "My queen, the archive holds a great deal of history I have not looked at in some time. You are not a man given to idle curiosity. You never have been." He held her gaze a moment too long, and something in his own eyes must have given him away, because her expression shifted from irritation into something closer to alarm. She did not believe him. That night, for the first time in 18 years, she gave an order meant to bury a truth she had believed safely gone. If you are already suspecting what the queen might be hiding, tap the like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because an old man is about to risk everything he has left for a girl he has known only a handful of days. Zuri woke before the birds, as always, and reached for the small pouch where she kept the necklace at night. The pouch was empty. What she could not have known was that a servant loyal to the queen had slipped into the room hours earlier and lifted the necklace without disturbing a fold of cloth. By morning it was already sitting in a locked box in Queen Adisua's private chambers, exactly where she had ordered it taken. Zuri searched everywhere, with a rising panic that surprised even her. It was, after all, Only an old necklace, scratched and worthless in any market. But it was the only thing that had ever come with her from wherever she had truly begun. Mid-morning word had reached the queen, and Zuri was summoned. "I am told," the queen said, once Zuri stood before her, "that you have lost something. My necklace. My queen. I cannot find it anywhere. Please, if anyone found it and did not know its meaning to me, perhaps," the queen said, cutting across her with a coolness that made the room feel colder, "you should stop pretending that some worthless trinket makes you special. It was scratched brass, girl, not gold. You have wasted half a morning weeping over rubbish." Zuri, in her distress, did not register the strangeness of that sentence. But 2 rooms away, Baba Kondo had heard every word through an imperfectly closed door, and he had examined that necklace himself in better light than the queen had ever seen it in. It was gold. The queen had just described, with confident precision, an object she claimed barely to have glanced at. Queen Adisua had spent the hours since the courtyard incident in a state few in that palace had ever seen her occupy genuine, private fear. She had believed, for 18 years, that the matter was settled. The fire had been convenient in ways she had not entirely planned, but had certainly not discouraged. The child had never been found. The kingdom had grieved and, eventually, moved forward, and she had married a broken king and slowly made herself indispensable to a household that had no reason left to look backward. She had not accounted for an old steward's memory, or for the particular cruelty of coincidence, that the very girl she had spent 6 years dismissing as beneath her notice should turn out to be the one person capable of undoing everything. She had already sent a servant to remove the necklace before the girl returned to her duties. A small, contained act, the kind of decisive correction that had served her well for 2 decades. She told herself, pacing her private chambers, that it would be enough. That an old man's suspicion, without the object itself, would amount to nothing more than a grieving retiree's confused imagination. She was still telling herself this when Baba Kondo requested an audience that evening. He confronted her in a small antechamber where he knew she took her evening tea, alone, once the household had settled for the night. "I would like the necklace," returned the girl, he said, without preamble. "I do not know what you are speaking of." "I think you do. I think you have known exactly what that necklace is since the moment you heard I had been asking questions about it." The queen's composure cracked, very slightly. "You are an old man, remembering old griefs badly. I would advise you to stop before it costs you the pension this palace has continued to pay you. I remember that night very clearly. My queen," Baba Kondo said, and something in his voice had gone hard in a way it had never been in 40 years of service. "I remember who insisted the nursery watch be reduced. The week before the fire." He set a folded paper on the table between them, a copy of the guard roster from that week. "And beside it her own signature, authorizing the reduction." Queen Adisua looked at the paper for a long moment without touching it. "Paper," she said finally, "proves nothing but that a guard rotation changed. Guards rotate every season, Baba Kondo. You would need far more than a schedule to accuse a queen of anything before this court, and you know it." "I have more," he said. "I have a portrait and a goldsmith's own notes, and a necklace that matches both exactly. I have a girl who hums a lullaby she was never taught, and a scar behind her ear that matches a physician's record 18 years old. I have proof now, and I intend to bring it, and the girl, before the king." For a long moment, the queen said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost every trace of its usual command. "You do not understand what you are threatening to undo," she said. 18 years, Baba Kondo. 18 years of order, of a kingdom that grieved and healed and moved forward. "You would tear all of that open again for a kitchen girl who does not even know her own name." "She has a name," Baba Kondo said quietly. "It was always hers. You simply made certain nobody used it. For 18 years, so that no one would ever think to ask whose daughter she truly was." Baba Kondo did not sleep that night. He sat alone in his small quarters at the edge of the palace grounds, and finally let himself remember, in full, completely, without flinching away from any part of it, the night he had spent 18 years trying not to remember too closely. The old king's first wife, Ronk, had given birth to a daughter the previous spring. The kingdom's long-awaited heir, Baba Kondo had personally overseen the nursery watch for the better part of a year, one of the most secure corridors in the palace. The week before the fire, the guard rotation on that corridor had been quietly reduced by half. And then, 2 nights before the fire itself, reduced again on the authority of Adisua, then only an ambitious young noblewoman with old family alliances at court, already bitterly resentful of the child standing between her family's ambitions and any closeness to the throne. Baba Kondo had questioned the reduction at the time. He had been told, firmly, that the matter did not concern him, and that a steward's role was to manage, not to question the authority of those above him. He had let it go. That was the piece he had never forgiven himself for. Not the fire itself, but the moment before it, when he had noticed something wrong and chosen silence. The fire broke out near midnight, in a storage room adjoining the nursery wing, and spread with a speed that suggested, though nobody had ever proven it, more than simple accident. The palace descended into chaos within minutes. Baba Kondo reached the nursery among the first, found the infant alive and unharmed in her cradle, the smoke not yet thick enough in that particular room to have reached her, and lifted her out himself. The corridor toward the main hall, where the king, the guards, and Adisua were all gathered, was already choked with smoke and confusion. Something about the shape of that chaos felt, even then, less like accident and more like cover. So he went the other way, through a servant's passage, out a side door, into the kitchen gardens, where he found a laundress named Folktale, a quiet, honest woman he had known for years, tending frightened animals in the confusion. He placed the infant in her arms and told her, in the fewest words he could manage, to take the child far from the palace, to raise her as her own, to tell no one, and to keep, always, the necklace at her throat, because it was the only thing that would ever prove, if the day came, who she truly was. He returned to the burning wing within minutes. By the time order was restored, the nursery was declared empty, the child presumed lost to the flames, and grief settled over the kingdom so completely that nobody but Baba Kondo ever thought to ask whether the ashes had actually contained what everyone so readily assumed. Runk died 2 years later of a grief-heavy fever that physicians could not fully explain. Adisua married the grieving king 2 years after that, 4 years after the fire that had made her path to the throne possible in the first place. Baba Kondo did not know whether she had set that fire herself or simply seen an opportunity in chaos she had not caused. What he knew now, with complete certainty, was that the girl scrubbing pots in the palace kitchen was the same infant he had carried out of that burning wing. He rose before dawn, having decided, somewhere in the long, sleepless hours of remembering, that whatever the cost to himself, silence was no longer a choice he was willing to make twice in one lifetime. He dressed quickly, meaning to explain everything to Zuri gently. He was too late for gentleness. 2 guards already stood outside the servants' quarters when he arrived. Inside, Zuri knelt on a bare floor for the second time in 3 days. This time in a holding room reserved for staff accused of theft. Overnight, the queen had formally charged her with stealing royal property and spreading dangerous rumors. A charge serious enough to carry a public flogging and permanent exile. The punishment was set for sunrise, timed so the king would be occupied and unlikely to hear of it until it was already done. "You have until sunrise," the queen told him in the corridor, her composure fully restored. "After that, even you will not have standing to interfere." Queen Adisua had moved faster than he expected. Overnight, she had summoned the household steward and formally charged Zuri with theft of royal property and with spreading dangerous rumors about the crown, a charge serious enough, in that kingdom, to carry a public flogging and permanent exile. The punishment had been set for the following dawn, before the king's morning council, when Adisua knew he would be occupied and unlikely to hear of it until it was already carried out. Baba Kondo dismissed the startled guard with the authority of 40 years' habit, and sat down across from Zuri with a gentleness he had not shown anyone in a long time, because gentleness was the only thing left he could offer her that the queen could not also threaten to take away. "Zuri," he said, "I need you to trust me with something impossible." She looked at him warily, but something in his manner, the seriousness of it, the sorrow, kept her silent. 18 years ago, he said, this palace lost a princess in a fire. The whole kingdom believed she died that night. I am one of only 2 people alive who knows that she did not. I carried that child out of the flames, myself, and gave her to a woman I trusted completely, and told her to keep one particular necklace at the child's throat always, because it was the only proof that would ever exist of who she truly was. He told her everything then: the reduced guard, the queen's signature, the Tucanvinia chaos, the necklace's exact match, the lullaby she hummed without knowing its origin, the scar behind her ear, the gesture of her hand rising to a necklace that was, now, no longer even at her throat to rise toward. That cannot be true, Baba. I am nobody. I have always been nobody. You were never nobody, he said. You were simply hidden. There is a difference, though I understand it may not feel like one, sitting where you are sitting. Suri listened and wept, and asked questions an old man did his careful best to answer, and by the end of that long conversation, something in her had shifted, not into certainty, not yet, but into a willingness to consider a truth too large to accept all at once. What do? We go to the king. Now, tonight, you have until sunrise before that punishment is carried out, and I will not stand by and watch it happen to the king's own daughter. And if you are wrong, Baba, what happens to me then? Then you will still be exactly who you were this morning, he said. But if I am right, and we say nothing, you will spend your life to corridors from your own father, and he will die without ever knowing you lived. I am an old man. I do not have many more chances to make this right. I have been a kitchen girl my whole life, Baba. I do not know how to be anything else. What if I stand before the king, and I am simply wrong, and everyone in that hall watches me be wrong? Then you will have been wrong in front of people who will forget it within a season, Baba Kando said. But if you say nothing, and I am right, you will spend the rest of your life scrubbing pots to corridors from your own father, and neither of you will ever know what stood between you. I would rather you be wrong in public than right in silence. Zuri, I have already lived 18 years with that particular silence. I do not recommend it. She was quiet a long moment, looking down at her own hands. Rough, work-worn hands that had carried water and scrubbed pots for as long as she could remember. Then she nodded, once, and rose from the low table. They moved quickly through the darkened corridors. The hour already late, the sunrise deadline pressing at the edge of every step Baba Kando took. But the queen had not spent 18 years protecting a secret without developing contingencies for exactly this kind of moment. She reached the king's private receiving hall before them, and by the time Baba Kando and Zuri arrived, guards stood at the entrance with instructions, delivered by the queen herself moments earlier, that no one was to be admitted without her express permission. My king, they heard her say, a kitchen servant has been discovered wearing stolen royal jewelry. I have already recovered the item. I did not wish to trouble you, but Baba Kando has taken an unusual interest, and I feared he might raise it inappropriately. Deal with it as you see fit. Adisua, the king said, weary. I trust your judgment. It was precisely the outcome she had been counting on. Baba Kando stepped through the doorway anyway. My king, forgive the intrusion, but I must ask you to hear something before this matter is closed. He laid out everything. The reduced guard, her signature, the child he had carried to safety, the necklace, 18 years of silence, kept out of fear rather than loyalty. This is absurd, the queen said. An old man's confused memory, dressed up as conspiracy. Bring the girl in, the king said quietly, and something in his voice silenced even the queen. If this story is moving you, subscribe now, because what happens in the next few minutes will change how you see everything that has come before it. Word of the confrontation had already reached every corner of that hall by the time guards were sent to bring Zuri from the holding room where she had spent a sleepless, frightened night awaiting a punishment that, for the first time since it was ordered, no longer felt certain to come. Zuri was brought in, still in her plain kitchen wrapper, still bearing the mark of 6 years of hard work in her hands and her posture, standing before a king she had glimpsed from a distance, perhaps a dozen times in her whole life, and never once been permitted to approach. He studied her for a long, silent moment, searching her face for something he could not quite name, some echo of a wife he had loved and lost, and a daughter he had grieved for 18 years, without ever once permitting himself to hope. What is your name, child? Zuri, my king. And you have no memory of your own family. No memory before the woman who raised you. None, my king. I have only ever been told that I was found as a very small child. My queen tells me you recovered a piece of jewelry from this girl. Takeen sighed, turning to Adis. I would like to see it. It was returned to storage. My king, I would need to send for it. Send for it now, said the king. I find I am curious about a piece of household jewelry that required the queen's personal attention to recover. It took 10 unbearable minutes, in which nobody in that hall spoke, before a servant returned with a small cloth-wrapped bundle. The queen had not destroyed it after all, whether from sentiment, or caution, or simply the habit of a woman who never discarded anything that might later prove useful. Baba Kondo would never know for certain. He unwrapped it himself, in front of the king, and turned it over to show the reverse side. A crescent moon. My king, cradling 3 stars. I do not need to tell you what that mark means. You commissioned the goldsmith yourself for your daughter's naming ceremony. No other necklace in this kingdom's history has ever carried it. The king took the small necklace in his own hands, and Baba Kanda watched something in his face shift from confusion into the beginning of a recognition, too large to voice yet. My king, do you remember the song you used to sing to your daughter? Baba Kanda asked. I heard it many times, standing watch outside that nursery. Zuri has been humming it, unknowingly, for as long as anyone has known her. The hall had gone utterly silent. Even the queen, still pale and rigid near the far wall, seemed to understand that whatever happened in the next few minutes was no longer within her power to shape. Do you know a lullaby, child? The king asked. One you cannot explain the origin of. Zuri, trembling now, nodded slowly. I have always known one, my king. I do not know where I learned it. It has simply always been there, since before I can remember anything else. Sing it, the king said quietly. Please. Zuri's voice shook at first, then came out whole, a simple, tender tune only one man in that room had ever sung to an infant, nearly 2 decades earlier. The king's composure broke entirely. He knew that song. He had written it himself, and sung it to no one else in his life. No record, no careless retelling, could have taught it to a stranger with such unconscious accuracy. He crossed the room and took Zuri's face gently in both his hands, searching it now, not for proof, but simply for his daughter, and finding, in the shape of her eyes and the set of her mouth, an echo of her mother he had spent 18 years trying not to see in every young woman's face, and finally, here, was permitted to see fully. Ronk's eyes, he whispered. You have your mother's eyes. Baba Kondo produced the final proof, the birth physician's record, noting a small scar behind the infant princess's left ear. Zuri brushed her hair aside to reveal the mark exactly where the record said it would be. The king made a sound that was not quite a word, and gathered his daughter into his arms in front of the entire assembled hall. 80 years of grief and hope, finally, impossibly, resolving into a single unbroken moment. Behind them, Queen Adisua had gone the color of old ash, and every guard in that hall now understood, without being told, exactly whose authority they answered to. The investigation that followed was thorough, and it did not take long, once it began in earnest, to confirm everything Baba Kondo had already pieced together. Servants who had been too frightened to speak 18 years earlier came forward now with fragments of memory they had carried silently ever since. The guard roster, the signature, a pattern of small decisions that, taken together, told a story no reasonable person could dismiss as coincidence. Queen Adisua was brought before the king 3 days later. The whole court expected her to be punished harshly. The king surprised them. You kept my daughter alive, he told her, even if you did it for the wrong reasons. I will not pretend that counts for nothing. However small a thing it is beside everything you took from her. She was removed from power within the week, stripped of her title, and exiled permanently from every court in the kingdom, not executed. For the king, even in his fury, was not a man inclined toward that particular cruelty. But this is not, in the end, a story about her punishment. 3 days later, Zuri returned to the kitchen one final time. She stood in the doorway, looking at the floor where she had spent 6 years on her knees, the fire she had tended every morning, the small room where she had once dreamed of a life she never believed could belong to her. The king found her there. "You were never beneath this palace," he said. "You were the reason this palace was built." It took her in the same hand that had scrubbed pots, and reached 1,000 times over 18 years, for a necklace she had never understood the true weight of. Word spread through the household within the hour. By evening, servants who had once ordered her about, who had looked past her at every meal, who had never once wondered whose daughter the quiet kitchen girl might be, knelt in the same courtyard where she herself had once knelt in humiliation. She'll let them kneel only a moment before asking them, gently, to rise. It was not the picture of herself she wanted this palace to carry forward. Zuri did not let it go to her head. That, more than anything else, was what the king would later say. He admired most about his returned daughter, that she had not emerged from 6 years of invisibility, hungry for anyone else's humiliation in return. She remembered too well what it felt like to be looked past. She kept the kitchen much as it was, and visited it often, and made certain, personally, that every servant there was properly fed and properly rested. Small things, she said, that had cost her nothing to receive and had meant everything to be denied. Her first act, once her position was restored, was a decree simple, permanent, that no servant in that kingdom would ever again be treated as though their worth were measured by their birth rather than their character. Baba Kondo lived to see her formally presented to the kingdom as heir, standing at her side that day as he once had at her cradle. When asked, in his old age, what he was proudest of in a long life of quiet service, he never once mentioned his 40 years as steward. He spoke only of one night and one small necklace, and a decision made in a burning corridor to trust his own instinct over the chaos around him. It was, he always said, the only decision in his long life he had never once doubted. And the one, he liked to add, that he was proudest to have made in silence, and even prouder, at the very end, to have finally spoken aloud. For 18 years, the palace had treated its lost princess like a servant. That day, the kingdom finally learned what an old man had known for 18 years and a young woman had only just discovered, that royalty is not always wearing a crown, and that sometimes the truest heart in any palace is found kneeling on the floor of its kitchen, scrubbing pots nobody else was ever willing to notice or carry. Thank you for joining us for this story. Subscribe to Untold African Folktales Stories and click the bell so you never miss a story. Watch our next story here.